What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Steelers Breakdown podcast. We're at a special edition today. The Steelers trade George Pickens to the Dallas Cowboys. I'm working on 1 hour sleep, folks, so I'm working on pure fuel that I got left. But let's talk about this. I was up all night trying to talk to people, trying to get as much information as I could. So let's talk about what I know. First of all, they are trading George Pickens. They are getting a third round pick. What I also heard was some pick swaps potentially, sixth rounder somewhere around there. That's kind of being worked out still. The exact details of the late day three stuff. But it sounds like the Steelers are going to be getting some compensation there, some good compensation, a third round pick. And folks, I know a lot of you will say that's it for him. The Steelers had multiple conversations with teams at the NFL draft. They talked with teams, they called teams and asked if they wanted to take George Pickens for a day two pick. They got no takers, including the Cowboys at that time. The Cowboys were talking with some other trade targets; those fell through. They have then since pivoted to Pickens. If you're wondering why the timing of this, that's part of it. The Cowboys targets fell through. They pivoted to Pickens. They were willing to give up that third round pick. The Steelers now get that third round pick. But folks, from what I've learned, this is the high end. This is probably the highest end of that range for George Pickens as a trade value. He was not getting any more for the reasons that we have talked about them moving on from him. The lack of kind of week to week maturity is a very much a thing that is worried around the league. Some people worry about that. The talent's great, but there is a worrisome factor to that. I also think there's a few things here. The Steelers are actually, compared to what they would have gotten, this is good value because I'm not sure there was another team out there that would have given them a day two pick. As I was talking about getting a third round pick at this point, it's a good value for them in terms of what the league was willing to pay. Now, would you rather have kept him? That's the question. But here's the reason why they didn't keep him. And there's three things I heard, and these are the rationale reasons for why they didn't keep George Pickens. One, they had told him that he was not going to get extended this summer. He was not happy about that news. And this summer was not going to be exactly clean with that. It was probably going to be a holdout, a hold in. We could have been looking at a very much a similar situation to Brandon Ayuk from last year or just a straight holdout, but it would have made headlines. The Steelers didn't necessarily want to deal with that. They're already going to be dealing with one big contract in TJ Watt. Um, Two, it didn't really sound like to me, from what I've been talking with people, that George Pickens really wanted to be here anymore. And we hear that all the time. Volunteers, not hostages. The Steelers want guys that are willingly bought in. And as the trade rumors swirled before the draft, a lot of that came out of that. It didn't sound like Pickens was very happy anymore once they were very upfront with him that he probably wasn't going to get an extension. And he said, okay, I'll move on to somewhere that maybe will give me an extension. And we'll see if Dallas gives him that. But that is something to think about. And so, three, on top of that, they get another day two pick here on top of their compensatory picks. Folks, they are full in here on this 2026 quarterback plan. And so those are a few reasons why they moved Pickens and why they didn't really see this. Why didn't they just stick it out with him, right? Those are a few reasons they didn't necessarily see this as super viable for them. That's what I've heard. So let's talk about this from an analysis standpoint here. Just wanted to get some of the inside info I had out there for you guys, trying to kind of talk you through the reasons why this is happening, why it's happening now. Some of it is the impending things that might have happened to training camp. Another part of it is I don't think Pickens was actually super happy in Pittsburgh. So I think those are all things that led to this. And so the Steelers in general here, I think, are kind of trying to turn over a new leaf. They really are in this locker room. They're trying to change kind of how they're evaluating players. And so that's part of it. But here's the thing. The Steelers are losing a talented player. And there's going to be a hole across from DK Metcalf now. They signed Robert Woods, but as we've talked about, Robert Woods is not really that guy anymore. He's not a top three wide receiver in a rotation type of guy. He's a guy that maybe plays 10 snaps a game and is blocker. Um, So the Steelers are going to have to do something, right? It doesn't mean that they have to trade for somebody. They could if they wanted to. But do you go out and sign Amari Cooper? I guess you could. Keenan Allen's out there, but again, these are guys coming off down years, significant down years, by the way. And so right now you're really staring at, I think, a top three of DK Metcalf, Robert Woods, and Calvin Austin, which is just not really, to be quite honest with you, that doesn't strike fear in anyone. And then your depth receivers being Ben Skowronek, Roman Wilson, probably Scotty Miller. I mean, it's just not gonna strike fear in the hearts of opponents. Now, I do think, if you're looking at long-term benefit, I think this has long-term benefit for the Steelers. This is the max value they're going to get from him. So when they determined that they had to move on from him, which they did around the NFL draft, because they did not plan to move on from him at the combine, but once they were upfront with him that he wasn't getting an extension, it seems things soured there, and that's why this is part of why they moved on, just to avoid all of that. And so once you got there, you wanted to get good value, and the third round pick for them is good value here. They weren't going to get much better value outside of this, and so a third round pick is fine, but they're going to have to find something here if they want a viable passing attack. If you sign Aaron Rodgers, and you're trying to win this year, you need another receiver, right? You need a better receiver than those guys as your two and your three, which really highlights, passing on the wide receiver in the draft. I mean, we talked about this a few times, passing on Alec Ayamanor um, for Jack Sawyer. I mean, that feels like a big missed opportunity right now to me. And unless it's Sawyer's a solid player, but they just had depth at edge. Imanor was also a great value pick. No one thought he was going to fall to the fourth. So you look at that as a missed opportunity. Could you have maybe gone out in free agency and made a move there? There's a real question there. And so there's a lot to take in here. Um, I don't hate the value for the Steelers. I know a lot of people are going to say that's it for him, folks. With the circumstances, I don't hate what they did here. I understand why they're moving on from him, and that's probably going to be an unpopular opinion. And I understand that. I understand the talent that George Pickens is. I understand what he kind of brings to the table and what losing him is going to do for the offense. It's going to significantly hurt the offense, and it continues what I think is a very wishy-washy offseason, a half in, half out. I think if they had done this and they had kind of been consistent about the future, and there's some things that are consistent with the future, but then you go out and trade for DK Metcalf, who can kind of work as a short-term, long-term answer, but then you sign, Darius Slay, for example. You make a lot of win now moves. Signing Aaron Rodgers is a win now move. It's not a lose later. It's not a lose now move, right? They are kind of half in, half out, and they've been half in, half out the entire time. And so that's really where the Steelers are at here. And this is another one of those moves. Again, I think the process behind this is just kind of poor. The process to get here. I think, trading Pickens was always a viable move for them, just because of the reasons I stated. I think it made sense in that regard. If you're not trying to necessarily fill out the holes on your team specifically, and you're trying to have that 2026 draft in mind and trying to turn this ship around as quickly as possible, it made sense to try and get draft capital for him. But when you were kind of doing this half in, half out stuff, that's where it's frustrating to me. It feels like this team just doesn't have clear processes they follow. It feels like a franchise that's trying to win while also trying to retool and rebuild. And it's just really hard to do that. You got to commit one way or another in a lot of ways. And so the Steelers are kind of this half in, half out weird team. I mean, obviously they're not going to trade TJ Watt. They're going to sign him long term, right? If you were full on tanking, like the Steelers aren't full on tanking, right? If you were full on tanking, you would trade TJ Watt. They're not going to do that, obviously. But this move kind of signifies a weird kind of paramount in that kind of discussion. So it's very odd, and they've always been in and out, kind of a little wishy-washy. And so I think the move's fine. I really do. I know people, love George Pickens. There's a lot of big time George Pickens fans out there. I got so many messages from you guys about it. But the Steelers had reasons to make this move. I just think the process, really not behind just this move, but the offseason as a whole has been a little wishy-washy at times. And I think this kind of highlights it again. But I think the move itself in a vacuum is not a bad move. I think a third round pick plus, the day three swaps. I mean, that's good value for him. Again, this didn't really feel like a tenable situation. It felt like one where both parties were ready to move on from one another. It felt like one where they would be better off without each other. He wasn't coming back in 2026. And so he now gets to go to Dallas on a new team and at a place that is going to have a very prolific passing offense. He's going to have a great year, I think, with Dak Prescott in that offense. That could be a high flying group across from CD Lamb. They could really, really put up some points on that board. So I think he's going to have a great year. I think he's set himself up well to actually get a nice payday this offseason. But the market just wasn't there for him on the trade value market. This was the top of his value. So the Steelers, where they're at, this is kind of exactly what they offer. That's what they need. That's what they wanted. They wanted a day two pick, and they got it. Still moving towards that 2026 direction, and this kind of wishy-washy 2025 offseason that just feels like one where they couldn't decide what they wanted to do. So it's a very odd kind of in out type deal. And so we'll see how this season goes. I think it's going to be a very odd season. And they trade George Pickens, odd timing behind it all. But I tried to explain the timing to you guys. Obviously not perfect. They wanted to do this during the NFL draft. They could have, but they didn't really address that position to me. I think they might view Robert Woods as kind of addressing that. I don't really view it as that, but they may. And we'll see what they end up doing here. I wonder if we're talking about potential trade targets. We're talking Aaron Rodgers here. I'm wondering, Alan Lazard took a big pay cut to stay with the Jets. I wonder if they could pry him out of New York. I mean, that's not exactly a panacea. That's not a fix all. That's not going to be something that wows your brains, but I do wonder if that's a place they could go to keep an eye on. So just keep an eye on there. But yeah, I'm sure this comment section is going to be kind of explosive and all that. And if you have questions in the comments, I'll try to answer them as best as I can, guys. Obviously, George Pickens being traded, big news for the Steelers. And so we will see kind of how the rest of the offseason here plays out. Folks, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, turn the notification bell for more. Thanks for listening, guys.